Deep in the mountains north of Madrid, there is a building that looks less like a palace and more like a prison. Cold gray granite rising from dry earth. Thousands of windows that somehow let in almost no light. Silent corridors, bare stone walls. And right at the heart of this frozen labyrinth, a tiny bedroom with a hard bed and nothing else. From that room, one man controlled more of the world than any human being who had ever lived.
His name was Philip II of Spain, and he died completely broke.
This is not a story about war. It is not a story about religion. It is a story about money, about the dangerous illusion of wealth, and about how the richest king in history became the world's most spectacular financial failure. Not once, not twice, but 9 times over. And in doing so, he took the most powerful empire on earth down with him.
Let's go back to where it started.
Philip inherited his throne from his father, Emperor Charles V, a man who had spent his entire reign on horseback, fighting the French, the Ottomans, and anyone else who got in his way. Wars, as it turns out, are extraordinarily expensive. Charles funded his military machine by borrowing from Europe's great banking dynasties, particularly the Fuggers of Augsburg.
When he finally stepped down in 1556, exhausted and broken, he handed his son a crown, an empire spanning multiple continents, and a catastrophic mountain of debt. Philip did not inherit a fortune, he inherited a mortgage.
But Philip had something his father never did. In the high Andes of modern Bolivia, the Spanish had discovered a mountain literally made of silver. The indigenous population was enslaved and worked to death pulling ore from the earth. That silver was melted into bars, stamped with the royal seal, and loaded onto massive galleons. Once a year, the treasure fleet would cross the Atlantic and arrive in Seville, groaning under the weight of bullion.
It was a river of silver flowing directly into Philip's hands.
Philip looked at that river and decided it would never run dry. He believed God was personally funding his empire. That belief was the beginning of the end.
Within a single year of taking power, Philip launched a massive military campaign against France. His army crushed the French at the Battle of St. Quentin in 1557. The road to Paris lay open. He was the undisputed master of Europe. But his soldiers needed paying, his suppliers needed paying, his bankers needed their interest. Philip looked at his treasury and found it empty. The Silver Fleet had been delayed.
The tax revenues from his own kingdom had already been spent 3 years into the future. And so, just 12 months into his reign, Philip II declared the first sovereign bankruptcy of the modern era.
He did not call it bankruptcy, of course. Kings do not go bankrupt. He called it a suspension of payments. He converted all his short-term high-interest loans into long-term government bonds at dramatically lower rates. To the bankers, this was legalized theft. The Fugger family, who had helped build the entire Habsburg Empire through decades of lending, were crippled almost overnight. Their fortune, tied up in royal debt, was now worth a fraction of its original value. But here is where the story gets darker. The Fuggers were replaced by an even sharper group of lenders, the Genoese bankers from northern Italy. These men looked at Philip's bankruptcy and saw not a warning, but an opportunity. They knew he would always need more money. They knew he could not function without them. So they lent to him again, at higher interest rates, with collateral that included Spain's salt mines and sales taxes. They were not his bankers anymore. They were his landlords.
Philip accepted every condition, because Philip never stopped spending. The Dutch revolt consumed him. 17 wealthy northern provinces, increasingly Protestant, rose against his rule after he brought the Inquisition to their doorstep. He sent his most feared general, the Duke of Alba, with thousands of veterans to crush the rebellion.
The Duke established the Council of Blood, executed thousands, including the highest nobles in the land, and introduced a tax so crippling it destroyed the entire Dutch economy and turned even moderate Catholics into enemies of Spain. The rebellion hardened into an 80-year war that became a financial black hole. Getting soldiers to the Netherlands meant marching them over the Alps from Italy along a route called the Spanish Road, and every single step cost money.
Food, boots, gunpowder, wages. When the wages stopped, the soldiers mutinied. And because of Philip's financial chaos, the wages almost always stopped. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire was expanding westward. Philip poured millions into building a fleet to stop them. In 1571, at the Battle of Lepanto, the largest naval engagement in history up to that point, Spain won a magnificent victory. The Ottoman fleet was destroyed. The Pope ordered church bells rung across Europe. But victory at Lepanto brought no money. It just brought more bills. By 1575, the debt had become impossible. When Philip declared his second bankruptcy, his soldiers in the Netherlands had not been paid in months. When the news reached them that no money was coming, they decided to pay themselves. In November 1576, the Spanish army stormed the city of Antwerp, the commercial capital of Northern Europe. They burned houses, murdered civilians, tortured merchants, and massacred 7,000 people in what became known as the Spanish Fury.
Philip's bankruptcy had turned his own army into a weapon pointed at his own empire.
A wiser man would have stopped. Philip doubled down. In 1580, he seized the throne of Portugal after its king died without an heir. He now controlled the Portuguese Empire too, all of Africa's coastal trading posts, the spice routes of Asia and Brazil. He was master of the oceans. But with new territory came new enemies, new costs, and new wars. He had doubled his assets and tripled his liabilities. Then came the Armada. The English Queen Elizabeth was supporting his Dutch enemies, harboring pirates who raided his treasure fleets, and representing everything Philip despised about Protestant Europe. He planned the ultimate solution, a fleet of 130 ships carrying 30,000 soldiers, sailing up the English Channel to overthrow the English crown and restore Catholicism to the island. He drained his treasury to build it. He borrowed every penny the Genoese would give him. He micromanaged every barrel of biscuit and every pound of gunpowder from his small stone room. In 1588, the Armada sailed. It was magnificent. It was also catastrophic. The food rotted because the barrels were made from green wood. The English ships were faster and better armed. Fire ships broke the Spanish formation off Calais. Then the wind came, what the English called the Protestant wind, and drove the fleet north to be shattered against the rocks of Scotland and Ireland. Half the ships were lost. Thousands of men drowned. 10 million ducats sank to the bottom of the sea.
Philip stared at the wall when he heard the news. He said he had sent his ships to fight men, not the winds of God. The bankers were unmoved by the theology. His final years were a slow-motion collapse.
He opened a third front by pouring money into France's Catholic faction to prevent a Protestant king from taking the throne. He was simultaneously funding wars in the Netherlands, the Atlantic, and France with revenue that could not cover even one of them. He debased his own currency, flooding Spain with cheap copper coins that triggered devastating inflation. The price of bread exploded, the middle class was destroyed, the poor starved. In 1596, Philip declared his third bankruptcy in the most brazen manner yet, declaring his debts legally invalid on the grounds that the bankers had charged excessive interest. He simply refused to pay. The banking houses of Genoa collapsed. Spain's credit was finished.
The Dutch used his paralysis to recapture key territories. The French king converted to Catholicism and united his country against Spain. Everything Philip had spent tens of millions to prevent came to pass anyway. He died in 1598 in that same small stone room where he had made every catastrophic decision of his reign, in constant pain from gout and ulcers, holding a crucifix that had belonged to his father. He had inherited a debt of 20 million ducats. He was leaving one of 100 million. His last words to his son were, "I meant to leave you a rich kingdom, but I leave you a poor one."
Here is what history teaches us through Philip's story. Silver and gold are not wealth. They are just metal. True wealth comes from productivity, from building things, from investing, from sustainable systems. Spain became a funnel. The silver poured in from America and flowed straight out to English merchants, French manufacturers, and Italian bankers. While Spain was spending, the Dutch and English were building banks, trading companies, and industrial economies.
When the silver slowed, Spain had nothing left underneath it.
The most powerful empire in history proved that you cannot conquer the world on credit. Even if you control the greatest treasure ever discovered, eventually the bill comes due.
And the repo man does not care how many kingdoms you own. If this story of power, debt, and collapse made you think differently about wealth and history, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. There's a lot more history like this waiting for you. Stories that explain how the world actually works, told the way they deserve to be told. See you in the next one.